The European elections last week saw big gains for the left and also for the right. The center did less well, with immigration as a major campaign issue.
Professor of History and Director of the European Institute at Columbia, Adam Tooze explains the rise of nationalism and hard-right movements over the past few years in his New York Review of Books article, Democracy and Its Discontents. Joining us now is Professor Adam Tooze.
Oh, thank you for having me
So there has been a conversation, or we have been watching over the past few years, right? This rise of nationalism, rise of populist candidates. And there's a conversation as to whether or not we are watching democracy and the safeguards, the guardrails of democracy sort of drifting away, criticizing the press, the court system sort of losing their oversight. Is this what we're seeing? Is this part of sort of a larger wave, or is it just sort of is it just sort of a, what's the word I'm looking for? A coincidence or an aberration? Yeah.
What we are seeing is a breakdown in the centre parties. So the former Christian democratic parties, which were moderate conservatives in Europe, or the moderate social democrats, those parties in systems with proportional representation where voters actually have a choice and you can have multiple parties forming, they're definitely losing ground. And we saw this spectacularly in France and Germany at the weekend in Europe, where the classic parties that once upon a time would have had 80 or 90% of the vote, much more like the American or the British systems, really lost ground. What we see in Britain and America is that though the party structure remains doggedly and boringly intact because of the nature of our electoral systems, the content changes. So what we see in both Britain and America are incredible turf wars within the Democrats and the Republicans for control of these instruments of political advancement, the agenda of which can vary all the way from Bernie Sanders to somebody very centrist like Biden, and all the way from Romney to somebody very far right within the Republican Party. So that is a common trend, a dissatisfaction with the old formulas where politics, ideology, constituencies, entire neighborhoods, regions of a country were siloed in blocks. That kind of politics is really broken down.
Professor, let me ask you about the rise of nationalism and ethno-nationalism over the past couple of years, as evidenced not only in Europe, but here in the United States, where the President of the United States is consistently, when he takes to the stage, talks about an us and them mentality. I want to ask you if, in your estimation, the rise of nationalism, and specifically ethno-nationalism, is tied to race, or is it tied to culture? For years, the knock on France, for example, where I spent a third of my life, was that the French are not prejudiced and they're not racist, they just want you to be French. And if you are French and you behave in whatever they deem to be French, then that's okay with them. Have you seen a shift to where it's like, no, you must be Anglo-Saxon, or you must be, of a particular race to be considered of that country?
I mean, I think you have to say that in America right now, we're pretty much in the worst case scenario where you have everything layered. You have classic anti-black racism, you have anti-Latino prejudice, and you have Islamic-phobic cultural antipathy being mobilized by the American right wing in an incredibly toxic cocktail. I think that has to be accepted. I'm not sure that it constitutes a huge surge in racist opinion, but what, as you say, is really novel is that from the very highest office in the land, this kind of language is being indulged. The president isn't drawing lines. The Bush presidency, for instance, was glowing in many terms in the way in which it talked about Latino migrants and the risks and the sacrifices they would make for their children. President Bush gave a remarkable speech about the way in which people would trek across the desert to enjoy the good life in the US.
As President Reagan.
Yes, exactly. So that used to be part of Republican politics. That has gone, and instead we see this compounding. In Europe, it's an incredibly mixed picture. And again, I don't see a huge rise in new types of prejudice, though you might say that the refugee crisis of the 15 and 16 period triggered that. But you also see quite serious anti-racist mobilization. It's estimated that about a third of Germans either contributed to, funds, or actively participated in the refugees welcome movement of 2015, 2016. So again, I think what we're seeing is a sort of polarization, a clarification of the fronts, a disinhibition on the right wing in really speaking in a very frank way about prejudices that people in the bien-pensant centre of politics thought were really being pushed out of public life. And on the other hand, a really quite serious mobilization in favour of a more open society.
So for the people that are sort of wringing their hands about democracy, right, is there an argument that the very nature of democracy is that it's going to ebb and flow, that if here in a liberal democracy, we elect somebody like Donald Trump, who some have accused of chipping away at the very structures of democracy, that's just the nature of democracy. And I'm sure when women were fighting for the vote and when, black people were fighting for the vote, there were people saying, oh my gosh, that's the end of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to make a distinction between places where we've already reached a tipping point. A country like Hungary, for instance, where large parts of the media are basically being gutted by a government which clearly intends to be in power permanently. That's sort of more down the Turkish Erdogan end of things. So that kind of struggle can reach a tipping point where it goes in the wrong direction. In general, I would agree with you that everyone who is a Democrat needs to understand that this is, this isn't just for Christmas. This is something you need to fight for every single day. It's in the nature. But what I also would focus on is less the institutional battles and more the substance of policy. I mean, democracy will be safe when it delivers good things for the majority of the population, when it delivers broad and inclusive growth, when it addresses in a serious way the migration issue. I mean, part of the weakness of liberals is they don't appear to have an answer, and so people with simple answers appear to are able to claim the centre ground. How that is, I think, what we need to be thinking about is what kind of answers, positive policy, can people who favour democracy actually deliver.
So you've reviewed, and again, pointing out that this is in the New York Review of Books, you have a series of reviews of books that have come out recently. Let me read some of the titles for our audience. The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. How Democracies Die. The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, and America. How Democracy Ends.
It's dismal.
Some though might say, look, I'm looking at the titles of these books and these authors. This is very academic. These are professors writing books, and maybe it doesn't strike at perhaps the popular sentiment that may exist in some of these countries.
Well, I think the real tension is that the movements which are often labelled populist can also be movements of popular enthusiasm. In fact, participation in the European election went up significantly. This is the highest turnout we've had since the early 80s. Likewise, in the German election, which in 2017, that was such a shock election, we saw a huge surge in participation, and part of the process was the AfD, the right-wing party, was mobilising people to vote who'd never voted before. That seems to me a healthy contest, but it does indeed pose the question of what the relationship between the structures of the Constitution and the rule of law are on the one hand, and what the relationship of those is to the participation of the people in the democratic process, which is how you end up with something like Yascha Mounk's title, The People Against Democracy. He distinguishes between a kind of elite liberalism, technocratic government by those who know best, and the mobilisation of popular opinion around parties which are genuinely popular. And the least that you can say for somebody like President Trump is that those who support him very strongly. They are impassioned supporters of his vision. So if one wants to argue with that from a democratic point of view, the only project can really be the mobilisation of a countervailing majority that's capable of beating him in an election on the terms which are free and fair. The mobilisation of voters' resistance to vote suppression, all these kind of politics, with a view to continuing that struggle.
Right.
It used to be that we would point to countries that did not have democratic institutions like China and say, hey, look, they're becoming more like us in that they're becoming more capitalist, and it doesn't seem that way anymore. And that's a discussion we could have for another 10 or 15 minutes. But this has been really, really, really fascinating, Professor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me on.